You will all know the Cheviot Mountains, capped with snow and belted about by storms. They sit like a great hinge in between the two kingdoms of England and Scotland, and their slopes go down into prosperous fields. And it was at the foothills of these mountains that Marchlaw, a great grey stone farmhouse, sat. Now this was the home of Peter Elliot. Now Peter Elliot had about 500 acres, and here and there was a post or a stone, and that marked out his land. But neither he nor his neighbours took too much notice of whether their sheep strayed from one man's pasture to another, for it was in the same spirit of friendship that the masters strayed from one man's house and one man's table to another. Now, Peter Elliot was a strong, strapping man, and he was a champion at all the sports and the wrestling matches, and he was really champion in all the land between Jedburgh and Wooler. And all the competitors quailed when he was around. Now, Peter was married to Janet, and she had been his bride 20 years before, but she was still just as beautiful to him now as she was the day she walked down the aisle. Between them, they had 9 handsome children. And Janet and Peter felt themselves to be blessed. For Peter had grown richer than his fathers before him. Peter was blessed with his wife, he was blessed with his children, and he was blessed with his flocks. And all his neighbours and even his farmhands loved him. And yet still a blight was passed over the season of his plenty, and gall rained down into his cup of joy. One Christmas, when he and his family were all gathered together inside the house, there was a storm outside which was blowing. The sun had risen, the most cold and miserable sun that one could ever see. All the snow that had been binding the earth for many, many weeks was being drizzled on by grey, stinging rain. The wind howled down the gullies, and it sounded like the lamentations of spirits, bringing avalanches of snow down into the plains and swelling the rivers to great torrents and floods. But no matter, for in Marchlaw the fire burned in the grate and twinkled on the faces of all the guests that were assembled. For this was not just Christmas, it was their son Thomas's 19th birthday. In the kitchen there were a whole host of guests, and their faces were shining to the firelight as they smiled. For before them there was a great long table groaning with food, and it stretched all the way from England to Scotland, because Marchlaw had been put right on the line between the two kingdoms. In fact, it was one of the few boundaries that Peter Elliot was concerned by, because although his grandfather and his father had been born in the room above the parlour, and were then definitely Scotchmen, but Peter, he had been born in the room above the kitchen, 2/3 of which was in England, and so he was never quite sure which nationality he belonged to. However, that made little difference, especially on this day. And so there they were at this great long board groaning with food. On the English side there was a ponderous plum pudding all studded with temptations. There were sirloins and sausages sizzling. And on the Scottish side there was a great steaming haggis and sheep's head and trotters and lots of delicacies in between. Well, all the guests were there with smiles on their faces. And Peter Elliot stood up with the carving knife in his hand, ready to carve, when his eye went to his right hand, and he saw that the chair next to him was empty. "Janet," he said, "where is Thomas? And on a day like this?" I'm sorry, neighbours, I must go out and see if I can just see him outside the door. Would you excuse me? For I cannot begin to start without him. And so Peter Elliott left the company. Well, there they stood and sat. And everybody waited, and their stomachs started to grumble. And all the guests looked up and down the table, and they started to get very hungry. And then they grew peevish. And then they grew gloomy as they saw an excellent dinner ruining in front of their very noses. Well, Mrs. Elliott tried her best to keep their spirits up, but in the end she turned to the dark-haired, beautiful young girl by her shoulder, and she said, "Elizabeth Hinny, do you not ken where he is?" Well, the girl looked up with tears in her eyes, and her lip trembled, and she shook her head. And so in the end, Mrs. Elliott had to ask her guests to begin without them. Well, they didn't need a second invitation. And soon all those sirloins and sausages and pies were disappearing, and humour was returning to the scene.